standing in the hospital hallway near the elevators at the end of a long night shift, my former mother-in-law looked me dead in the eye and told the surrounding nurses that her son had finally gotten the family I was too broken to give him. I didn't raise my voice or try to argue, because I knew the legal papers sitting in my attorney's office were about to prove a very different truth. And 5 minutes later, a man who was never supposed to be in that wing walked through the double doors and shifted the entire story. Welcome back to Payback Stories. I'm Patricia, and if you enjoy stories about family drama, betrayal, and karma finally catching up, make sure to hit subscribe and drop a comment. Let's get into it. I have spent more than a decade working as an emergency room doctor, which means I am used to keeping my focus when everything around me is loud and chaotic. When you spend your nights stitching up injuries and stabilizing people in critical condition, you learn early on that panic does not solve anything. You learn to take a slow breath, look at the facts right in front of you, and do your work without letting your hands shake. For a long time, I believed that same steady mindset would protect me in my personal life. I thought if I simply did the right thing, stayed out of gossip, and let my work speak for itself, the truth would naturally sort things out. That philosophy worked everywhere, except inside my own marriage. I married Kenneth when I was 28 years old. He was the kind of man who could walk into a crowded room and make everyone feel like his closest friend within 5 minutes. He remembered birthdays, knew everyone's family history, and had a warm smile that made people trust him without second thought. For the first couple of years, I trusted him just as completely. We bought a modest house in the same small Ohio town where we both grew up, settled into our routines, and eventually decided it was time to start a family. Months turned into a year, and then 2 years passed without anything happening. In my line of work, when something is not working as expected, you run tests to figure out why. It is standard practice, cold and objective. So one evening over dinner, I brought up the idea of both of us going to a clinic for a routine fertility evaluation. Kenneth did not take it well. He did not yell at first, but his face hardened in a way I had not seen before. He laughed it off as ridiculous, saying that men in his family did not have those kinds of issues. When I tried to explain that standard testing was simply a normal first step for any couple, he became sharp. He told me we should just have faith and stop trying to analyze everything like a medical case. I brought it up once more a few weeks later, and he shut the conversation down so forcefully that I dropped it. You cannot force a grown man to walk into a clinic if he refuses to go, so I went by myself. I saw a specialist, went through a complete battery of blood work and imaging, and waited for the results. A few weeks later, the report arrived. Everything on my end was completely clear. My reproductive health was normal, with 0 underlying issues identified. I remember sitting in my car in the clinic parking lot, holding that sheet of paper in my hands, feeling a strange mix of relief and growing unease. If my health was completely fine, then the situation at home pointed toward a very obvious question. But because Kenneth had flatly refused to be evaluated, there was no way to get a clear answer. And rather than having an honest conversation with me, Kenneth chose a very different path to handle his own insecurity. He began planting quiet seeds with his mother, Barbara. Barbara was a prominent figure in our town. She ran the local church committee with a rigid hand and viewed Kenneth as the centerpiece of her entire life. She had raised him alone after her husband passed away, and in her mind, Kenneth was incapable of flaw. If something was wrong in his life, it had to be someone else's fault. So when Kenneth started dropping subtle hints that our struggle to have children was likely due to my health, Barbara accepted it as absolute fact without asking for a single piece of proof. It started out as soft comments at Sunday potlucks and neighborhood gatherings. Barbara would lower her voice, put on a look of tragic sympathy, and tell people how hard Kenneth was trying to keep our home together despite my unfortunate limitations. At first, I had no idea these conversations were happening. But slowly, the atmosphere around me shifted. At a community dinner that fall, Barbara introduced me to a visiting guest while resting a hand on my shoulder in a way that felt entirely performative. She introduced me as her daughter-in-law, adding with a heavy sigh that while I was very focused on my hospital career, it was such a genuine pity about my inability to build a family. The woman she was talking to gave me a sad, knowing nod. In that single moment, holding a paper plate in the middle of a church hall, I realized that a complete narrative about my body had been written, finalized, and circulated without my knowledge. When I asked Kenneth about it on the drive home, he brushed it off. He told me his mother was just worried about us and that I was being overly sensitive. He said people in town were just showing concern. I stayed silent. That was my biggest mistake during those years. I convinced myself that fighting back against petty town rumors was beneath me. I thought if I kept my head down, focused on my patients, and acted with dignity, people would eventually see that I was not bitter or broken. I did not understand yet that when you remain silent while a false story is told about you, people assume your silence is a confession. The only person I vented to during those hard months was my longtime friend, Amanda. Amanda and I had known each other since high school chemistry class. She had been by my side through my undergraduate years, my medical training, and my father's passing. She was my maid of honor, standing beside me in a light green dress while I read my vows to Kenneth. When the town gossip started making me feel isolated, Amanda was the person who came over to my house with takeout, sat on my living room sofa, and listened to me talk through my frustration. Looking back now, the support she offered always had a subtle edge to it. She would tell me that maybe having a family just was not meant for a high-achieving doctor like me. She would remind me how lucky Kenneth was to stay with me despite the town's expectations, and she would gently advise me not to push him about going to a clinic because it might damage his self-esteem. I took those words as genuine comfort from a loyal friend. I failed to notice how often she would text Kenneth directly under the guise of checking on his mood. I failed to notice how she gradually became familiar with his work schedule, his favorite meals, and his personal complaints about our marriage. I was so relieved to have one person in my corner that I never stopped to ask why my closest friend was so comfortable stepping into my personal space. The end of my marriage arrived on a random Tuesday evening. I walked into my house after a grueling 14-hour shift in the trauma bay to find a large envelope sitting on the kitchen island. Half of Kenneth's clothes were gone from the master closet. He did not wait for me to come home. He did not leave a note. He had his legal papers served and moved directly into Amanda's apartment across town that same night. Within 48 hours, the local social circles had constructed their final story. The narrative was simple and unforgiving. Patricia was cold, married to her hospital shifts, and incapable of giving Kenneth the child he desperately wanted. Amanda was painted as the supportive, caring companion who stepped in to save a heartbroken man. Barbara made sure every member of her social group heard that version of events, and Amanda said absolutely nothing to clarify the timeline of when her relationship with Kenneth had actually started. I was completely blindsided. But once again, instead of publicly defending myself or posting the truth on social media, I retreated into my routine. I woke up at 5 the next morning, drove to the hospital, set broken bones, managed emergency admissions, and carried out my work with absolute composure. I thought that enduring the embarrassment quietly was the most respectable choice I could make. What I did not understand was that my willingness to endure the lie was actively destroying the career I had spent 15 years building. 6 months after the divorce was finalized, the position of emergency department director opened up at my hospital. I was the senior physician on staff. I had spent 7 years developing the local trauma response protocols, training the nursing staff, and running the unit during peak crisis periods. Everyone in the department knew I was the most qualified candidate for the leadership role. Then the selection board met. Out of the 5 members on the credentialing committee, one was a local businessman who played golf regularly with Kenneth's family. During the closed-door evaluation, subtle comments began to circulate about my personal life. Questions were raised about my emotional stability, my stress management, and whether the public drama surrounding my divorce indicated poor personal judgment. When the decision was officially announced, the directorship was handed to a physician who had been at the hospital for less than 3 years, had 0 protocol management experience, and worked half my clinical hours. The committee chairperson called me into a private office to deliver the news. He offered me a vague explanation about wanting to preserve department harmony and suggested that taking on leadership might be too demanding given my recent personal adjustments. I sat in his office, listening to his measured, polite tone, and felt a cold realization wash over me. The false narrative Kenneth and his mother had spun to protect their own pride had moved far beyond church suppers. It had invaded the one sanctuary I had left, the emergency room where I had given everything to my profession. That evening, I did not drive straight home. I sat in my car in the hospital parking lot for an hour, looking at the familiar brick building. I realized that my quiet patience had not been a sign of strength or dignity. It had been permission for dishonest people to walk all over my life without consequence. By refusing to confront their lies, I had let them rewrite my identity, rob me of my dignity, and take away the career advancement I had earned. The next morning, I called a respected attorney named Jacqueline. Jacqueline's practice operated out of a quiet building on Main Street. She was a woman in her 60s with sharp gray eyes, clear-spoken language, and zero patience for empty dramatic posturing. When I sat down across from her, I laid out the entire history. The marriage, Kenneth's refusal to undergo medical testing, my own normal diagnostic report, the systematic public comments made by Barbara, the sudden divorce, and the loss of the hospital directorship. Jacqueline listened without cutting me off once. When I finished presenting the timeline, she set her pen down flat on her desk. She explained that while small-town gossip is rarely worth pursuing in a courtroom, what I was describing had directly crossed the line into actionable defamation and false light. Barbara and Kenneth had publicly made definitive medical statements about my physical health to third parties, and those specific statements had now directly caused measurable financial and professional damage through the denial of my promotion. She told me straight out that pursuing a civil defamation suit would force the entire private matter into the public record. She asked if I was truly prepared to have my personal medical history discussed in open court. I looked down at the desk, took a deep breath, and told her I was done hiding from a story that was never true to begin with. 3 weeks later, Jacqueline filed the formal legal complaint in the county court. It named Barbara and Kenneth, detailing specific dates, location contexts, witnesses who had heard the public statements, and the direct financial impact on my career following the hospital board's decision. The news spread through town like wildfire. Barbara was furious. She spent the next several days telling anyone who would listen that I was a bitter, vindictive ex-wife trying to ruin her family out of pure jealousy because Kenneth and Amanda were building a life together. Kenneth stayed quiet, relying on his attorney to file a response. And that response was precisely what Jacqueline was waiting for. Kenneth's legal counsel, assuming they could easily crush the lawsuit, filed a formal defense claiming absolute truth. They argued in court papers that the statements made by Barbara were not defamatory because they were factually accurate, asserting under oath that I was indeed the sole reason the marriage had produced no children due to medical infertility. When Jacqueline called me to read their filing over the phone, her voice was completely focused. She pointed out that by asserting the defense of absolute truth, Kenneth's legal team had made an enormous tactical error. In order for them to prove that I was the sole cause of the childlessness, the actual medical reality of both spouses during the marriage was now the central legal question of the case. They could no longer claim privacy regarding reproductive health when they had explicitly put that exact medical issue forward as their primary legal defense. Jacqueline immediately filed a motion requesting the court to compel the production of Kenneth's full medical records relevant to reproductive health from the duration of our marriage. Kenneth's attorney fought the motion with intense urgency, filing objections based on doctor-patient confidentiality and personal privacy. But the judge recognized the clear legal reality. Kenneth could not publicly claim under oath that my medical state was the absolute cause while simultaneously refusing to allow the court to examine his own medical records from the exact same timeframe. While we waited for the judge to rule on the motion, a memory came back to me that I had buried years earlier. It was during our second year of marriage. Kenneth had taken an unexpected day off work and driven 2 hours up to a specialized medical clinic in the city, claiming he had an out-of-town errand to run. When he returned home late that afternoon, his entire demeanor was off. He was withdrawn, sharp-tempered, and poured himself a drink before dinner, something he almost never did. When I asked if his trip went well, he snapped at me, saying the appointment was a complete waste of time and that I should stop questioning him. Looking back at that day with a clear mind, the sequence of events was obvious. It was right after that trip to the city clinic that Kenneth had permanently shut down all discussions about fertility testing at home, and it was shortly after that same week that the very first rumors about my physical limitations began circulating through his mother. I shared that specific date and the location of the city clinic with Jacqueline. 2 weeks later, the county judge granted our legal motion. The court ordered the city clinic to produce Kenneth's relevant medical records under a strict protective order for judicial review. The records arrived at Jacqueline's office on a rainy Thursday morning. She called me in to review them in person. When I sat down in her office, she placed a single, redacted page on the desk in front of me. The document was a formal diagnostic report from the city specialist, dated precisely 7 years ago, during the second year of my marriage to Kenneth. The clinical diagnosis on the page was azoospermia, a complete absence of viable sperm. The report clearly stated that Kenneth was medically incapable of fathering a biological child through natural means. I sat completely still in that chair, staring at the black text on the white paper. For 6 long years, I had been framed as the broken spouse. I had absorbed the pitying looks at potlucks, listened to the snide remarks about my career choices, and endured the quiet loss of my marriage and promotion, all while Kenneth possessed absolute written confirmation that the inability to have a child rested entirely with him. He had taken his own medical reality, buried it in a sealed file, handed his shame to me, and let his mother parade me around town as a cautionary tale. The weight of that discovery did not make me scream or break down. It brought a profound, freezing clarity. The narrative that had defined my life for years was a deliberate, calculated cover-up constructed to protect one man's fragile pride. I took the copy of the report, folded it neatly, placed it inside my handbag, and drove home in complete silence. 8 days later, the situation took an unexpected turn that shifted the foundation of the entire case. I received a text message late at night from a number I had blocked long ago. It was Amanda. The message was short and frantic. "Patricia, please drop the lawsuit. Think about the baby. You are going to ruin everything for a child who has done nothing to you." I read the text twice. The defamation lawsuit was strictly between me, Kenneth, and Barbara regarding statements made about my personal medical history and the loss of my hospital position. Amanda was not named as a defendant in the civil suit, so why was she begging me to stop the legal proceedings to protect her newborn son? Then the mathematical reality hit me with absolute precision. If Kenneth had received a definitive diagnosis of complete azoospermia 7 years ago, and if he had never undergone medical treatment or specialist intervention, which his produced medical history confirmed he had not, then the baby boy born to Amanda 3 weeks ago could not possibly be Kenneth's biological child. Amanda knew Kenneth's history. She knew that once the medical records were fully introduced in court proceedings, the obvious biological contradiction would force a formal paternity evaluation in related legal filings. She was not terrified that my lawsuit would cause emotional stress to Kenneth. She was terrified that the legal system was about to expose the fact that her child belonged to someone else entirely. I did not reply to her text message. I forwarded the screenshot directly to Jacqueline and went asleep. The morning of the court hearing arrived 4 weeks later. The matter was scheduled in the main courtroom of the county courthouse. Word had spread that the proceedings would address the validity of the hospital board's decisions and the underlying claims made by the Bishop family. The public gallery was crowded. Members of Barbara's church committee were seated in the middle rows. 2 members of the hospital credentialing board were present to observe. Kenneth sat at the defense table beside his legal counsel, looking pale and noticeably thin. Barbara sat directly behind him, maintaining her rigid posture, though her hands were clenched tightly over her purse. Amanda sat near the very back of the room, completely isolated. And 3 rows behind Amanda sat a man named Raymond. Raymond was a quiet local technician who had dated Amanda briefly during a period when she and Kenneth had briefly split up the previous year. He had been asking questions around town for weeks after noticing the timeline of Amanda's pregnancy, but Amanda had cut off all communication with him the moment she moved in with Kenneth. Raymond had come to the courtroom that morning to hear the truth for himself. The judge called the session to order, and Jacqueline took the podium. She did not raise her voice. She did not use dramatic language or make personal attacks. She presented our case with the calm, methodical precision of a surgical procedure. First, she laid out the documented public statements made by Barbara over a 3-year period. presenting sworn affidavits from community members who had heard Barbara attribute the childless marriage explicitly to my physical health. Next, she established the direct financial and professional harm, placing the written minutes of the hospital board meeting alongside the salary figures of the directorship position I had been denied based on those false personal rumors. Then, Jacqueline turned to the defense's claim of absolute truth. She walked over to the exhibit table, picked up the court-certified medical records produced under the judge's order, and read the key diagnostic findings directly into the public record. She read the date of the evaluation, the name of the city specialist, and the explicit medical diagnosis, proving that Kenneth had known since the second year of our marriage that he was entirely infertile. A heavy, absolute silence fell across the courtroom. The church members in the gallery turned their heads slowly to look at Barbara. Barbara's face completely drained of color. She looked at her son's back, her mouth slightly open, as the reality of 7 years of deception washed over her. Jacqueline did not stop there. She stated for the record that because the defense had relied on claims regarding family planning and biological capacity, the verified medical records conclusively demonstrated that the entire narrative constructed by the defendants was a malicious falsehood designed to shift public blame onto an innocent party. She added that based on the certified medical evidence now before the court, formal cross-filings regarding paternity verification had been lodged in the family court division concerning the child currently attributed to Kenneth. Kenneth suddenly pushed his chair back and stood up at the defense table. "This isn't fair," he shouted, his voice cracking loudly in the silent room. "You can't bring this up here." The judge slammed her gavel down sharply. "Mr. Bishop, sit down immediately and remain silent, or you will be held in contempt." Kenneth sank back into his chair, covering his face with both hands. Barbara stood up next from the gallery row, her voice trembling with panic as she pointed a finger toward our table. "She's twisting everything. My son is a good man. Patricia was never built to." She could not even finish the sentence. The phrase she had used for years to tear me down collapsed in her throat under the weight of the court documents sitting on the judge's bench. The judge gavelled the courtroom to order once again, demanding that Barbara either sit down or be removed by security. Barbara fell back into her seat, completely silent, looking small and defeated. I turned around slowly from my chair at the plaintiff's table and looked at the gallery. I looked at the church members who had whispered about me for years. I looked at the hospital board members who had questioned my emotional stability. I looked at Barbara, at Kenneth, and finally at Amanda. I did not feel a sudden surge of triumph or joy. I felt a profound sense of relief, the quiet, clean feeling of stepping out from under a heavy burden that I should have never agreed to carry in the first place. The court adjourned for a short recess. Before the session could resume for final arguments, Kenneth's legal team approached Jacqueline with an immediate request to settle the matter entirely on our terms. They agreed to a full, unconditional retraction of all previous statements, a formal written confession of liability to be delivered directly to the hospital board of directors, and a financial settlement covering the complete salary differential of the directorship position alongside all accrued legal fees. Jacqueline presented the final settlement papers to me in the attorney conference room 10 minutes later. "They are offering everything we asked for," Jacqueline said, looking at me over her reading glasses. "The retraction will be part of the official public record. There is no non-disclosure agreement. The truth stands." I picked up the pen and signed my name firmly on the dotted line. The aftermath unfolded quickly over the following months. The hospital board of directors called an emergency meeting 2 weeks after the court hearing. They officially rescinded their previous appointment, issued a written apology for allowing unverified personal rumors to influence professional evaluations, and offered me the position of emergency department director. I accepted the role, not out of a desire to prove a point, but because I had earned it through 15 years of hard work, continuous training, and absolute dedication to my patients. Walking into the emergency department on my first day as director felt entirely different. The familiar smell of antiseptic and clean linens no longer felt like a hiding place where I went to escape small-town gossip. It felt like space I owned completely. I ran the department with the exact same steady hands and calm mindset I had always possessed, but I no longer let anyone mistake my composure for weakness. Kenneth's standing in the community collapsed completely. Small towns do not forgive a man who hides behind his mother while publicly humiliating his wife over a lie he constructed himself. Within 3 months, he sold his share of his local business, packed his belongings, and moved out of state. Barbara withdrew entirely from public life. She resigned from her church committees, stopped attending potlucks, and spent her days isolated inside her house. The social circle she had built around her son's false perfection simply moved on without her. As for Amanda, the mandatory DNA testing ordered through the court confirmed what the medical timeline had already proven. Kenneth was not the biological father of her child. Paternity was legally established for Raymond, who stepped up to take full parental responsibility for his son. Amanda and Kenneth broke up shortly after the court hearing, and Amanda quieted her presence in town, taking a job 2 counties over. A year after the court case concluded, I was cleaning out an old desk drawer at home when I found a small silver watch that Kenneth had given me on our 3rd anniversary. It was an expensive, shiny piece of jewelry, but it had always felt heavy and out of place on my wrist. I picked it up, walked over to the trash bin in the kitchen, and dropped it inside without hesitation. I spent 6 years of my life believing that if I stayed silent and endured unfair treatment, the truth would somehow take care of itself. I learned the hard way that truth does not do the work for you. Truth is simply waiting for you to find your voice, stand up, and refuse to carry lies that belong to someone else. Today, my department runs smoothly, my life is quiet and entirely my own, and I sleep peacefully every night knowing that I will never again allow anyone to define my worth. If you enjoyed this story, subscribe to Payback Stories for a new family drama story every day, and I'll see you in the next one.